The Foundation for Water Research is an independent community for professionals from across the water sector and related scientific specialisms. They come together for deliberative discussion to support the development of interdisciplinary solutions to freshwater challenges. The community provides guidance and strategic thought leadership for the Institution of Environmental Sciences water activities and collaborates with the wider IES family on issues relating to land, air and policy implementation. The community champions a systems approach to ensure that freshwater solutions are holistic and multifunctional and is informed by 3 technical panels, including the Water Resources and Quality Technical Panel, which has convened this group. The discussion today aims to explore the topic of the future of water resources. It's estimated that by 2050, England will face a gap between supply and demand of approximately 4 billion litres of water a day. Ensuring sustainable management and use of water resources is essential to securing a resilient water sector that can deliver for people and planet. This discussion brings together expert views on the future of water resources and focuses on potential solutions to the challenges the water sector faces. There isn't a live audience today, but we're recording the discussion and intend to post on our website and YouTube channel. We'll now kick off into the discussion, and to start with, I'll ask each person to introduce themselves briefly and outline in 1 minute what they think will be key to the future of water resource management. Can I start with Trevor?
Thank you, Ian, and a very good morning, everyone. Very pleased to be here. My name's Trevor Bishop. I have lots of roles these days because I'm an independent, but I think I'm probably here under my role as the chair of the West Country Water Resources Regional Group, which some of you may be aware. In terms of my statement, I think, and I don't say this as a boast, far from it actually, that I think I'm in my 4th decade of playing around with water resources now. And whilst we have an excellent regime and a brilliant community, I think the risk of failure has probably never been higher than we face now and over the next 2 decades. And I think there's 4 things which are really key. First of all, that we adapt the way that we plan to better reflect the new realities that we face. We really need to get even better at infrastructure development because there's a step change in what's coming and that won't be easy. We need to work very hard on public perceptions and culture around water and the environment, and we're not starting from a good place on that, as I suspect we all know. And also I think we need to take further our thinking on systems and resilience. I think we only just started to touch on what that really means and how to integrate it within the way that we think, we plan, and the way we operate our water resources. Thank you.
Thanks, Trevor. Thank you for being brief. Next on my screen is Andy Turner.
Good morning all, I'm Andy. I work for the Environment Agency as a water resources manager, and my team leads on the development of the national framework for water resources. And the Environment Agency's got the responsibility for the allocation of water resources in England and for ensuring its proper use. So that's a sort of perspective that I come at this from, and I think that I share a lot of the thinking that Trevor has just described. That the challenge ahead is unprecedented. There's significant pressure now on the nation's water resources, and recent droughts have exposed some of those pressures. And that pressure is only going to grow because of an increasing population, climate change, land use change, but it's also a global system, and there are pressures around the world that will also have an effect on what we do and what we need to plan for in England. So for me, the response needs to be around having really robust planning, of which regional groups are a key part of that. It's about making sure that we're multi-sector planning, multifunctional, we're able to deliver multiple benefits. And I think it's all action on all fronts, really. Demand management, resource development, they're both needed. And I think there's a paradigm shift happening now towards an era of resource development and demand management, whereas previously for the last 30 years or so, it's been pretty full on demand management in its entirety. So that's me. That's where I'm coming from. Yeah, happy to be here.
Okay, thanks, Andy. Can I go to Varsha next, please?
Hello, I'm Varsha Wiley. I'm a principal engineer with Southern Water. And I don't know everybody's background, so I'm going to come at this from a technical design background, I suppose, which is more my safe place and my sort of cup of tea, as they say. I come at this water resource management from a technology side, Ian, and I think from where we are at the moment, leveraging technology, leveraging AI, leveraging the way we actually produce water, the way we recycle water needs to be looked at a lot in order to manage what we've got. There are so many areas where really good quality treated water is going back into the environment that could be used for alternative purposes. I lived in the US for 3 years, and they do a lot of that kind of work, looking at irrigation of green, golf courses and all the rest of it. And to me, it's that synergy between what the water industry does and produces water and where we can look at alternative uses of that, using technology as a starting point. That's sort of my perspective.
Thank you. Alistair.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Alistair Leggett. I'm Integrated Catchment Manager and Water Industry National Environment Programme Lead for Affinity Water. Affinity are a drinking water only company operating in the southeast and east of England. I'm coming at it from the angle around the pressures on catchments and the role of catchment and nature-based solutions in supporting and meeting some of the challenges going into the future. I've been working around catchment management for about 15 years now. And the thing that's always apparent is the scale of land use change that we've seen over the recent decades, particularly with the growth of agriculture and intensification, urban development, the increase of concrete going down, development in the floodplains, and this re-engineering of catchments, and particularly this drive to move water out of catchments as rapidly as possible to support some of these industries, for me is a fundamental challenge, and I'm really keen to explore, build the evidence and really galvanise research around the role of re-engineering catchments to hold more water, to act as reservoirs in their entirety, both at the landscape but also at the regional scale, and what role in the longer term, because for me that's going to be one of the more sustainable solutions that we need to look at going forward.
Right, thanks Alistair. I'm not sure whether I pronounced it right, but Virginie?
Good morning. I'm Virginie Keller. I work for the UK Centre for Ecology and Hydrology. I lead a small team that works on water resources modelling. So we do both quality and quantity with a strong focus on anthropogenic influences. And more, we try to make sure that whatever we do in terms of research has applicability in the private sector or amongst the water users community. And I agree with all that has been said. For me, it's working. I mean, I have been working in water resources for a long time, but it's that integration part, so that all the different actors of the water community work together. We don't just look at one particular aspect of water resources, but look at it in its integrity. And the other thing that was also said, for me, it's working on the public perception. I think we do need to do a lot of work on that and try to engage them even in our research.
Okay, thank you. Lindsay.
Good morning. I'm Lindsay Hargreaves. Thank you for inviting me along today. I'm a farmer by background. Spent most of my working life managing large farming operations in the eastern counties, typified by a dependence on water for irrigation. So my interest in water comes from that. I don't operate at the farming coalface anymore, but I am still interested and involved in agriculture, especially the water resources aspect. So I'm a non-exec director of Water Resources East, representing agricultural interests. I chair a couple of local abstractor groups agricultural abstractor groups in the East. And I sit on an internal drainage board, amongst other things with water resources. I mean, in terms of the challenges, I wrote down five things very briefly. One is closing the gap. There's a huge gap. Can we do it? And that points, I think, to good science, the importance of science. There are a lot of people competing for this water, so the priorities. How are we going to set the priorities? Who's top of the list and who's bottom, or are we all genuinely equal? Timescale. Over what timescale do we plan to do this, and how does that impact these other things? And adaptation. So we're all going to have to change one way or another, and whether it's we change our farming practices, whether it's the way we change the way we store water, or the way we manage it in the environment, and when it comes down to business change, what is the time to adapt, and how do we adapt? And then I think for me the biggest one of all is who pays. Because this is going to cost a huge amount of money that we're not used to paying in this arena. And when you really analyze it, there are probably only three sources of funding. One is the taxpayer, another is the bill payer, and a third might be corporate or business budgets. And some are better able to manage these kind of changes financially than others. And for me, that is probably the biggest one of all, because those with the deepest pockets will probably find themselves at the higher up the priority listing than those who are less financially secure.
Thank you. And Paul.
Hi, Paul Hickey. I work at Ofwat with responsibility for water resources. A couple of reflections from me. The scale, as Trevor mentioned at the start of this, the scale of the planning challenge is unprecedented, primarily driven by the needs of the environment, which is very good. But a couple of reflections on that. Firstly, we do need to have ambition both on supply and demand management. I think the scale of the challenge has driven much more complex interventions, more contentious interventions. And that means I think the technical process needs to be complemented by deliverability considerations as well. That being said, we've also the planning process has become very complicated, and I think there's a real need to think about how we can simplify the process that we have. I was talking to a colleague at Water Sources South East earlier in the day, and we've spent nearly 5 years coming up with a 5-year plan, and that does need to be simplified. I think the other thing is, as Lindsay said, the cost now of managing future water source needs is very significant. So we do need to build confidence that is justified in terms of the environment in particular. And I say that not because I don't believe that it isn't necessary, but one of the things that we really do need is to engage people on the scale of the need and the role that they themselves play. And because notwithstanding the need for new supply schemes, we do need to drive a more efficient use of water resources. And I think at the heart of that is about engaging people on the environmental consequences of profligate water use. So those would be my reflections, Ian.
Right, thank you. And thank you all for being very brief. If I sort of sum that up as an initial introduction, then clearly planning and all the issues around planning come out from everybody. Public perception is certainly a big one. The whole breadth and depth of pressures that the water sector is facing. Technology in all of its forms, both as a delivery medium and as an issue in itself. An interesting one there, the breaking down silos within the water industry and the approach to public water use. Deliverability, and so I'm pleased to hear Lindsay's background, because my own background, I've farmed for 45 years and worked for the Environment Agency in flood risk for 23 years. So my background is very much around management of landscapes, and Alistair and I have long history of working together on trying to drive some change in how farmers manage our landscapes for the benefit of both farmers and for the water environment. And the other big one that's particularly come out in the last couple of comments was who pays. This is one that we can't just sidestep round all the time. So the first question I was going to throw to you was, what are some of the key challenges? I think that pretty much you've picked them out in all of that. Is there anything that anyone thinks that has been missed in amongst that in terms of a key challenge? Trevor. Yeah, go ahead, Trevor.
Thanks, Ian. I'm not sure whether Paul or I was quickest on the draw there, but anyway, I'll duck in first. So I think you're absolutely right. I think we've covered them broadly, but it might be worth just making sure we recognise how they operate together rather than just as individual pressures. So, we've reached a fascinating point in the history of water resources where more and more catchments are closed to new abstraction. So 20 years ago or 30 years ago, we would have pretty much gone out and taken a bit more water from the local aquifer or another river. Increasingly, that's not available. So we're looking at much more sophisticated, more costly, more challenging interventions than we've ever had before, including demand management and infrastructure. Demand is really set to increase quite substantially. It's not just the change in population, it's also the way we use water. So in our region, we've got potentially a big battery factory coming along. You've got hydrogen schemes, all these kind of things. So the change in use of water, all these are pretty intensive in carbon capture and storage. And the availability of water is decreasing. It's not only our catchments are at their sustainable limit, what we consider sustainable is actually increasing because of the level of environmental ambition, partly through climate change, partly through societal needs. So that gap you spoke about may not be static. It may actually get bigger, not smaller. So we need to have a flexible thing. And probably the most fundamental thing, and I think it was mentioned by some, but only maybe need to tease it out a bit more, is that we're facing deep uncertainty, principally because of climate change, and that makes planning really hard. If you know what demand's going to be in 20 years and you know what different sources can supply, you can pretty much plan in a deterministic way. We've got to manage with some very, very deep uncertainties in the natural system, which brings me to that last point that Lindsay, yourself and others spoke about, looking at this as a system, not as a series of silos, understanding resilience in terms of what it really means and planning in a resilient context. So I think everything was there, but I think it's the interplay between them is so important.
Thank you. And certainly there's been a strong tendency within the water industry for siloed thinking of things. And that's heavily replicated amongst the political approach to water. Hopefully we're starting to see that break down a bit, but it's certainly true that we need to pick that one up. Paul, you were next.
Well, I'm just going to really sort of build on what Trevor said. I mean, there is a tension in that for me in the how you plan for uncertainty and we're moving increasingly towards adaptive thinking, which I think is appropriate. But linked to that, though, or the tension in that is about ensuring that things are delivered. Because, I mean, it is uncomfortable that we are starting the next planning cycle not in the place we'd expected to be in a number of instances. So I think that how we have an adaptive approach to planning, but really do ensure that there's deliverability and things do happen, I think is equally important, and that's quite a tension, I think, but one that we do need to grapple with. Thank you.
It's an important point to not just plan things, but to also look back at the end of the plans and check whether you actually delivered them, isn't it? And work out what that does to your baseline for the next plan and how you could have addressed that. I think Andy was next.
I think Varsha's before me.
Oh, right. Varsha, do you want to come?
Yeah, thanks, Ian. It is really to build up on Trevor mentioned one thing there that really resonates well with me, and it's to do with that component of technology I was talking about at the very outset. Looking at how we've been talking about the water energy nexus, we've talked about circular economy, energy factories for wastewater. It's been bandied about a lot, but I've not seen it come to fruition in that way, bar on the wastewater side, where we've started to look at energy recovery from sludge. Phosphorus recovery, for example, to help our farming community has not been explored so much, but yet we operate a number of wastewater treatment plants, some really large ones. That's number one. Number two, when we look at all these great big technologies that will be deployed for recycling water, the use of reverse osmosis, which itself is very carbon hungry, there is an opportunity to pair with that the production of hydrogen and power back these wastewater treatment plants. The oxygen that will be the residual gas that will be produced, use that instead of blowers and bringing, converting this just the 23% of oxygen into aeration, use pure oxygen instead. So it's almost using and leveraging those bits of technology, not because we're going to constantly produce water, but look at the downtime and see how we can work with the other industries. When I look at the what is it called, the big old hydrogen map, it's called there is a technical word for it which I can't remember right now, but it'll come back to me. It will terminate in some of the strategic locations where these large wastewater treatment plants are within our region in the south of England. So you think, why not collaborate? Why not start these conversations, which I know I have, but it costs so much that you think, I don't know how to include this in my business plan because I'm trying to solve the water problem. I can't now engage into the hydrogen problem. But anyway, that's my take on life with this. But it was a really good point there, Trevor, with respect to the hydrogen bit and carbon reduction. That's me. Thank you.
Often very difficult to stay on top of just what is going on as well, isn't it? There's so many things. You get chatting to someone and they suddenly mention something that oh yeah, someone else is working on that. Right.
Absolutely.
Andy.
Thank you. Yeah, this is dynamic, as Trevor said. We've got emerging demands for the future, such as water for cooling, data centers, artificial intelligence. They will require water in the future. We've got a move towards re-wetting of peat for carbon capture. That's going to need water. You've got government policies that are going to ebb and flow, particularly around things like food security, energy security. They will have an impact on future water use. And then there'll be shocks and events around the world that will have an impact on us. So, for example, the last drought in Norway meant it was less able to produce hydropower. That had an impact on our energy markets. The obvious one is war in Ukraine. That's affected cereal and growing requirements, imports, etc. around the world. And then if you look at what's happening in Spain and the growing and irrigation of crops, well, with the drought there, some growers in Spain are actually relocating to Morocco. So you're getting all these different events that are sort of dynamic, but are going to have an impact on us, and there will be future shocks and things that we can't envisage, but we need to sort of plan for and have that adaptive planning. So what I think we need to do in our adaptive planning is to make sure that we've got a look at the resilience of the different solutions. And if you look at land management schemes, well, they could be reversible and they might only be there if the payments for managing land in a particular way continue. If you look at demand management and behavioural change, it's quite easy to take the foot off the gas and to revert back to a previous behaviour, unless it's embedded and you've got the messaging alongside demand management or some of the hard wiring of demand management. And if you look at what's happening in Australia, they are actually moving a little bit away from reservoirs being the mainstay solution for public water supplies because of the risks around not being able to fill them. So they're actually broadening out to less reliance on direct rainfall fed solutions, and there's a big shift towards desalination and treated wastewater as a more resilient response. So I think that the resilience of solutions is a really, really important challenge for us, and therefore with all those shocks and the different dynamic situation and the resilience of the solutions, what Paul said, spot on, that we not only need to be on our game in terms of planning, it's about deliverability as well. And the more we can do to enable and improve the pathways for deliverability, the better. And also, the more we're able to monitor and track delivery, see whether it is happening at the pace that's needed and delivering the interventions that we need and we've predicted. That's absolutely key as well. We need to monitor and respond to delivery, make sure it is happening, but change our approach if it isn't. So yeah, very, very complex and very dynamic.
Thanks, Andy. Lindsay?
Briefly, I think Andy's partly covered my point, but I was just looking at it slightly more internally, this political thing, and we've just been reminded, with a change of colour of government, that whatever trajectory we thought we might have been on at that level, with our elected political masters, we've now got a period where there is going to be some kind of reset, and and those people can have a big influence on the nature of the pathway and the speed of the pathway. So it's really that political thing. Thank you.
That's an interesting point in itself. How aware do we think the those that have just moved into power are of the breadth and depth of the issues that we're talking about here, and just how important they are? It's always the case that water is out of sight, out of mind of everyone except those of us that work in the industry, until it becomes a problem. The first time people think about it is when the river runs dry or you turn the tap on and nothing comes out. And as we all know on this call, by then it's far too late to actually do anything. Alistair.
Thanks, Ian. Yeah, I think I totally agree with everything that's been said. I think, there's another challenge that maybe hasn't been fully touched on yet, which links into the integration that's been mentioned, cost, but also, risk to some of those opportunities. And that's some of the big quality challenges that we've got either coming up on the horizon or already there. I mean, an obvious example is the nitrate time bomb impacting groundwater. That's one that we understand, we know quite a lot about, but will require a significant amount of investment and can significantly impact on ability to take water locally, move water around. I think one of the biggest challenges I think on the horizon is around PFAS, commonly known as the forever chemicals. There's still a lot to understand about them. They are ubiquitous. It's not just a national, it's a global challenge. We are just starting to understand the scale of impact, how challenging they are to take out of water. As these become more and more challenging, as water quality standards become more and more stringent, this could significantly impact on the ability to move water around. It could impact on issues such as sludge spreading to agricultural land, and subsequent schemes like phosphorus reuse, that kind of thing. Then you've got the destruction, the waste that comes out of this, and all of the cost that then gets stacked. And it also goes back to that point about who ultimately pays for this. I think we don't fully understand where this is going, and Affinity Water are very much at the sharp edge of this at the moment, and it could severely impact on our ability to achieve some of the environmental destination challenges at the regional levels that we have, and that may be something that isn't always necessarily linked into the water resources debate.
Yeah. I would add to that microplastics as well. There's growing awareness of that issue, but there's still no one's really grasped the nettle on that. No one's really worked out quite what it means for everything yet. From the agricultural side, particularly, there's discussion about whether it's acceptable to land spread sludge that's got high microplastic content in it, nanoparticles, but also pharmaceuticals as well. The whole issue about pharmaceuticals in wastewater streams, and that impacts again on what Varsha was saying about the need to reuse water more. The acceptable quality of a wastewater stream and how you bring that up to a pharmaceutically acceptable quality to reuse, whether it be for potable use ultimately, or even for non-potable use. So all the discussion about amphibians changing sex in watercourses and things like that. Right, okay, it's not as though we haven't got anything to discuss then, is it? Solutions. Who'd like to start with solutions?
Well, we've made a start in, haven't we?
Well, we have, yes.
It's so it's where we see the pathway. I thought it was interesting, Paul's comment that we're entering another planning cycle and we're not entering it where we thought we might enter it, and so what is so where would we have liked to have been, or why are we not there, and does that help us in sorting out where to go next? And if you I guess for me the real one is collaboration and this sort of cross-sector thinking. Have we really got that one working yet? And I think the short answer is probably not. But I think there's some really good seeds germinating in that field, and can we help them? And I know the work that Andy's done with his team in the agency and with DEFRA in trying to stimulate what Ofwat and so through Paul's work is identifying the significance of cross-sector working, and unless we have a genuine process and a genuine wish to work in that way, then we are I was just saying we're unlikely to be successful. We will be successful, but we'll all be unhappy, so we could arguably we could blunder on with the process, or we could progress with the systems and regulatory processes we have now, and PWS would probably be okay, and the environment would probably be okay, but the rest of us would be a bit grumpy. So how do we bring all that along? And of course, that should recognise, I think I'll pick up on Alistair's point about completely rethinking the way that that catchments work and the role they play. Because one thing I didn't mention, well, in my agriculture abstractor group work, we are doing some funded work on at a micro level on how we can approach water management in a small water unit area from several thousand hectares, but in the context of England, it's tiny. But what impact can we make if we better understand how it works? So does that say that the starting point of the solution is really understanding the problem? And we understand the problem at top level, which is we need to return water to the environment, or we need to take water out of the environment in different ways to the ways we're doing it now, and we think we know what that translates to in terms of a headline figure, however many megalitres a day. So, but so how do we get there? Are we building the right framework, for this journey?
And following from that, as Alistair said, we right at the start, we need to stop treating water as a problem and treat it as a precious asset. You know, the history of my old role in flood risk is a highly engineered approach of kick it out of the catchment as quickly as we can, and we can't afford to do that anymore. So
No.
yeah. The question, of course, with collaboration is who should be collaborating, how many people should be in the room, and how do we fairly share the say out between them? Trevor.
Thanks, Ian. And just to build on Lindsay's points to an extent and add a couple, if I may. I mean, I think we've all agreed there's a bit of a new era of interventions. And let's start with a bit of a success story, I think, which is now, I think, as Andy mentioned earlier on, the supply-demand gap, which is forecast, is planned to be resolved through almost an equal balance between managing demand for water downwards and building new infrastructure capacity. And to have said that 10 or 15 years ago would have been heresy. So I think there's been a real cultural change that we should all be really pleased about in the sector. Having said that, and building on Paul's points, delivering both those aspects, you know, is going to be far from straightforward. And on the demand management side, the ambitions are very high indeed. And there is a risk of undelivery because we're not talking about just water efficiency, we're talking about a change in behaviour. Now that's on a scale of social change, which I think, you know, this country has probably rarely seen or rarely been able to deliver effectively. So let's not pretend that, you know, that one's in the bag. On the infrastructure, as Paul said, following through on deliverability, making sure not only we can raise the money, but also, and I think this is equally important, we spend the money wisely. And we make the right decisions early in the process, we stick with them and we see them through to delivery. The second bit, as Paul and others and Andy have said, you know, planning is adapting, and that's really good. We've now got regional groups, we've got adaptive pathways, we're moving in the right direction, but there is so much more to do to make that process efficient and effective, I suspect. And the one thing which I think we all know is really hard to change in this world is culture, and it will require a change in culture to change the way that we think about planning in the future, so that will be key. And we've touched, I think Lindsay, Vasa and others talked about systems and systems resilience. And it's systems both in water supply. So as Vasa said, the links across to wastewater, but also energy internally and chemicals, etc. But also the supply network. There's no point in increasing or building lots of reservoirs if the pipes aren't big enough to deliver them to customers under future demand scenarios. And we plan in isolation still, and you know, too many people are not talking across companies and across planners, etc. And then there's the wider systems resilience. So linking into Lindsay's side on agriculture and water needs, on energy, on goods and services, all kinds of different things. Andy's doing some great work in the national framework on this, and Lindsay's really tuned into it as well. But the system, I suspect they're having to fight the system very often. The reason we plan in silos is because the world is a really complex place, and it just makes it so much easier if you can plan for one sort of area and then not worry too much about the links. But we no longer have that luxury. The imperative is that we have to understand the interdependencies and interrelationships across the natural environment and the human and economic environment in a way that we've never done before. That's a massive culture change for us, I suspect.
Good summary. Yes. Yeah. Andy.
Complex, isn't it? So I think there's, for me, going back to the allocation of water resources and the question about collaboration. For me, there are three ways that we can improve the allocation of water resources. One is through regulation. We've got the abstraction licensing system, which protects water rights and the environment, and that's the primary route for allocation. And water resources planning, it informs the approach about future applications for abstraction licenses. It helps to answer the justification of need question. So the better that we can get at planning, the more effective we will be at regulation and the allocation of water rights through the licensing system. So that for me is one big area that I think much of this conversation is about. Secondly, collaboration should and can take place within the framework that that we've got. So more integrated decision making. We are trying to get improved collaboration across different sectors of use through the regional water resources planning process and elsewhere, at national and local scales as well. So by having collaboration at that level, you get better quality decisions, you get more joined up decisions, you get more consideration of the things that Trevor has just referred to, you know, the wider complexity. So you get an enriched approach, and you're able to consider trade-offs if they're necessary in the future. Also within collaboration, I think there's something we need to do more of, which is about collaboration, about the identification and joining up on working through solutions, particularly between public water supply companies and energy companies. They're both involved in developing national critical infrastructure. You know, the worst case for me would be if you've got two desalination plants being built next to each other. You know, what you need to share the resource, you need to look at joint solutions and work those through. Also within collaboration, perhaps at a smaller scale, you've got opportunities to share water. We're working hard with the agriculture sector, so you might have a license that provides water rights, within which you've got a cluster of 12 farms, and they have that one license that gives them the right, it's been protected, but they are able to make season or year upon year solutions on how the water is allocated between themselves. You don't need to change a license for that. So there are local collaborative approaches. And then the third way of improving the allocation of water resources is through economic incentives. And, you know, we can see that on the sort of the public water supply companies looking at smart metering and tariffs. You know, it's economic signals that will potentially drive down water use and take some of the pressure off future supplies or the environment. So those three different ways of improving the allocation of resources: improve regulation and planning, improve collaboration, and drive through some of the economic incentives.
Thank you. Varsha.
Thank you, Ian. I'm looking at this from it's part of this conversation. It's almost a question followed up by some sort of views on it. It's when we look at our planning for our wastewater treatment plants, for example, we talked about pharmaceuticals, emerging compounds, forever chemicals and whatnot. Albeit the Environment Agency has done a stellar job looking at the environmental quality standards in order to improve the treated effluent that goes back into receiving water bodies. There are not many wastewater treatment plants that are lined up for an improvement, an upgrade, or anything like that. So you wonder at what point in time we will physically actually see improvement in the quality of the treated effluent going into these freshwater bodies. In the case of, let's say, rivers for this conversation, you wonder when those will start to happen, such that you reduce your risk. Now it's only plants that will be attached, like a wastewater treatment plant connecting up to a new water recycling plant is looking at improvement of technology in order to produce really good quality water. But you wonder whether we need to look at it a bit, you know, go back a little bit and start looking at this the really large wastewater treatment plants. Can they start to becoming water recycling plants in their own rights? And then you start to go down the chain a little bit in order to start to look at what we do have this availability of water. We just dumping it in a way into freshwater systems loaded with chemicals we could have potentially actually removed at source. Now, we cannot stop people from taking the medications. That will happen. We cannot, you know, stop hospitals from discharging what they do, that will happen. So it's incumbent upon the water companies to remove those contaminants from this water. So you wonder where do you start in that chain? Do you improve the wastewater treatment plant right at source and put really good, strong technologies to remove those waste products? And then what happens to that waste stream in its own right? Where does that go? So I honestly think we have got an ample supply of water. It's how we treat it for better uses and alternative uses. And Alistair said a great thing about nature-based solutions. We can leverage those. And I know I have done in the past for a water company that Paul and I used to work for back in the day. We've looked at those kinds of treatments. So I guess we can, it's almost where do you apportion the money and whereabouts in the chain it starts off. That's my main quandary, really, because we look at all these wastewater treatment plants, they really are water recycling facilities, but we're not utilizing them that way until it's a planned water recycling project that comes and connects with it. The last point that I will make is really, are our delivery partners, the contractors, and the technology providers, are they able to operate in our industry, given we've got some elements of the regulatory framework? Do they lend themselves to allowing these suppliers to perform and operate competitively? Because not everywhere around the world you would have the regulations that we have, for the right reason, I hasten to add, but can they freely operate like they do in the Middle East, where there is a load of competition because they're not tied up by certain. So looking at it on the whole, you think regulatory framework is one thing, but there is also, where do we put the funding along the chain? And that's where I always think, am I looking at it the right way as a designer? Are we spending money in the right places? So that's me. Thank you.
Yeah, so much in there, isn't there? Funding is always going to be a challenge. If you get to the point, as we said earlier, that the taps don't run or the rivers are dry, then nobody would say water isn't a priority. And it would be a very brave politician at that point that said, yeah, we shouldn't be putting this extra funding into the water industry. But the rest of the time, we're banging our heads against a brick wall all the time. And picking up again on the pharmaceuticals, I can't help but wonder whether there's any discussion whatsoever in the licensing of pharmaceuticals as to what their end fate is and what their potential impact is. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that we shouldn't be using these pharmaceuticals, but the companies that are developing them should have some responsibility for being able to advise how they can be broken down again, how they can be managed in the environment in the same way that a lot of the chemical industry is expected to. So,
absolutely.
Alistair.
Thanks, Ian. So I'm interested in with the lens on potential solutions, probably one that's not really very well understood at the moment, but is a key part of the chain of the water cycle that we can actually influence, and that's what happens when water hits the ground. And I'm really interested around the concept of soil as a key ecosystem service that really UK PLC should be investing more in. Obviously, we have a huge landmass where soil is receiving water. That soil can hold that water on land. It can pre-treat and filter that water, making the treatment of it, much less expensive. It obviously produces food, so it's it provides a vital commodity. But yet, I don't think we fully respected soils over the last few decades. We cultivate them, we churn them up. They erode, they wash off into rivers, they don't hold that water, they're heavily drained. But some slight changes in the practice of soil, the less disturbance of soil, building up organic matter can really start to hold more water on the land. It can really start to treat that water. It can reduce the impact on rivers and other receptors, and actually can provide greater sustainability and productivity for the agricultural sector and beyond. And there is more and more evidence gathering around the benefits, at the micro, but also at the macro scale, both from a resilience perspective, but you know, is there also the potential? And one of the areas I'm particularly interested in is the whole farm or whole catchment reservoir concept, and actually looking at that land as a reservoir, looking how you hold that for flood protection, for drought resilience, potentially reducing the need for irrigation in certain areas. And there's so much to be explored in here, so much research that needs to be brought out of the academic space into practitioners, where it can be applied on the ground, where it can be monetized, and ultimately the people that manage that land can then have, you know, receive that investment to make a real difference. I think there's some huge opportunities here. There's lots of good work going on in pockets. It's not very well joined up. We're not looking at it at the regional scale to see what kind of, you know, role it has to play, what benefit it can have. So I think there's something in there, and that really first stage of the water cycle that we could fix and ultimately start to measure and then predict and model those benefits into the long term.
Yeah, that Alistair knows only too well that that's one of the things that brought he and I together, and that we've been talking about for some time on this. It's quite a stark wake-up call for an English farmer to spend time talking to Australian farmers. I've got a friend down on the Liverpool Plains, not far from Sydney, who reckons he grows most of his crops entirely on the basis of stored water. He doesn't expect rainfall during the growing season. And that's the nature of their catchments. That admittedly he has 6 foot deep soils, so there's an awful lot of availability there to store water, but it's a completely different mindset, and that's something that that probably has quite a lot of potential for this. But it's how the industry as a whole collaborates with the farming industry, with how the water industry and the farming industry collaborate on this in order to foster that change in mindset and different approach. This whole thing about public demand, clearly half of the issue that we're facing is about managing demand, and half of it is about supplying the demand that exists. And Trevor quite rightly says that we haven't got a great record on delivering on our promises on public demand. Has anyone got any particular views around that one?
Is this are we thinking at household level here?
Everything really,
end user.
Anything that's consuming water from our environment. So that includes agriculture, but particularly in the southeast, it's focused on household use and business use. But in the east, the big issue is agricultural use.
So I know we've touched on it several times, even from quite a number of different angles this morning. It is how do you change culture? And there is an argument that says that water is just far too cheap at any level. You know, we don't value it in the way that we should, and that, you know, but I always find that one sort of difficult to elucidate, because you're finding yourself sort of promoting the fact that water should cost more in financial terms. In an ideal world, we will get people to understand the value of water, you know, as a scarce resource, not as something that whose scarcity is only represented in money. But maybe we come to the point where in our society that the financial driver is the only currency in the broad sense that we really understand. It's the only one we really respond to. So and that does sort of point towards smart metering and all those sorts of things. You know, we have seen changes there, and there is another aspect which is of this whole thing, and I guess it's all tied together, which I've become rather a nuisance at home about, is leaking loos. And wherever I go now, you know, if I use the facilities, I always make a note, and it's fascinating just how many leaking loos there are, and it's not a little problem, and so, you know, that points straight to building standards and the standards of engineering in the water industry, we never had quite so many leaking loos in the days of the old siphon systems and the overflow pipe stuck out through the wall. So you knew immediately when the loo wasn't working properly. But now most of the time people don't know, and even if they do know, it's just a nuisance. And I'll get around to fixing it one day. So what's the point of what I'm saying? I think what I'm saying is one or two things. We can, we know what the solution is. So right, what's holding us back? And I suppose the move towards smart metering and it was the move to metering at all gets complicated by those circumstances where it's very difficult to do. So how do you introduce metering, let alone smart metering, into a block of flats where there is only one meter, and it's very, very difficult to, the engineering solution itself is very difficult, but that's not a reason not to tackle them. But it's also not helped by the fact that from a regulatory point of view, and I think I'm still writing something, please somebody correct me if I'm wrong, is that there is no regulatory requirement if you are building a block of flats to put a water meter into every flat. It's still perfectly acceptable just to put a single meter on the outside of the building that's managed through the management company. And whatever that is a regulatory matter, then what incentive does the house building industry have to actually help us in this process? So there are some regulatory matters there where we could move along in changing people's behavior and changing their attitude towards water. I think these public awareness campaigns to say, it's really, really precious. It's they are important, and I guess if we we're all influenced by our children, aren't we? So that the earlier you can capture someone's imagination on this, the better it is. But of course, as they get older and more cynical, and if it's still cheap and it's still coming out of the tap, anyway. Sorry, Ian, I'm going on a bit. But
interesting, it's not just blocks of flats. The vast majority of properties can be metered in some form or other, yes. But where I was until last year, I'm now sat in a very water-rich part of Scotland, but I used to farm 20 miles north of London, farming what was an old country estate, a very small country estate with a manor house in the middle of it, and 17 residential properties there, all of whom were quite wealthy individuals commuting into central London for work, shared a single meter at the perimeter of the old estate. Well, two of them had swimming pools. They had no reason not to worry about that because there was no way of, under the current regime, of actually metering their use. So they were all on rateable value. Issues like that need to be picked up somehow. The big issue, of course, with doing it through price is how do you protect those people who have very low incomes? Because water is one of the few things that you cannot deprive people of. And that's always going to be a thorny issue.
Well, just picking up on that one, on smart metering gives us an opportunity there, doesn't it? And tiered pricing of water, which is, that's a good way. You could say there is a minimum amount of water that is required to support human life, and that is available at an affordable price, whatever that is. If you want some more, because if you want some more, you can have it at a higher price, and if you want even more than that, you can pay through the roof for it. So that's where I think where these technology solutions really do give us an opportunity.
Virginia, you put your hand up.
Yes, I was going to say along the same lines is the grey water recycling. That's another thing that could be implemented in the building regulations so that it becomes more of everybody's responsibility rather than perhaps just the water companies, for example. And it will help raise public awareness.
I completely agree with that. And just one last bit before we take a break, Ian. In a previous life, I used to look at from an engineering standpoint, looking at water conservation, water efficiency. And there used to be this code for sustainable homes that came out. I can't remember how old this is now, but they were for new buildings, weren't they? And looking at all sorts of gadgets that you can put into for water efficiency. But you wonder the cost of retrofitting those for some of these older homes, the ones that are really leaking through the bathrooms. it's so exorbitant now that a person would rather waste the water because it's cheaper to pay for that than it is to pay for a builder to come in and retrofit. So you wonder whether some of these elements should be looked at as well in order to conserve water. But I completely agree with Lindsay that gradation of volume and tariff, volumetric based tariff. I know on the eastern side, folks do that already for industrial users. But I guess this is something quite important to look at for domestic users, just to be able to manage how folks take water. I completely agree with that. And that's a really, really good point. That's me.
Yeah, and in terms of changing culture, it's very difficult to change people's culture and to change people's approach to water, and that's why, again, possibly the best way into that is through the building industry and with new estates.
Yes.
And to build it in a way that makes it difficult for people not to do it.
Yeah.
So the 1990s, I remember at Hatfield office at the EA, we had the master planners for Harlow North come to talk to us because they'd identified that there was inadequate wastewater treatment capacity in the catchment that they wanted to build 20,000 houses in. And they came to us with a fantastic solution. Whether it actually got implemented, I don't know, which was for 2 small wastewater treatment works within the development, which would then treat to a sufficient standard to provide a grey water supply through a public main back to each of the properties. And for all of the toilets to be flushed using that, and for the garden watering and everything else, all the outside taps to be using that, with a caution on that it was not for consumption, not for human consumption. And the advantage of that, of course, is that then that system gets maintained. Whereas if you build it in at the property level, there is the risk that the homeowner doesn't bother maintaining it. And after a while, the system falls into disrepair and they just draw clean water again all the time. So it's back to this: how do you make it easier for people to do what's right?
In the States, they have the purple piping system, which is exactly that. So if people already know purple pipes are not for drinking, they're just for irrigation and whatever else, non drinking purposes. Yeah, so that's a really good point. Thank you.
Just looking at the discussion so far, I'm looking particularly at Varsha, of course. Does anyone want to talk a bit more about desalination and how much of a solution that is?
Oh, the very fact that we relegated that option back in 2020, 2021. We relegated it down from being the primary option for meeting our supply demand deficit down to, I can't remember where it fell down to be fair, certainly after transfers between regions. It is because it carries a number of disadvantages, especially when we look at where we are. I think if there were no other options, like the Middle East, you're trapped already. You could understand how you kind of escalate it and go, right, I really need to deploy this. In our region, it's really difficult to say that. The cost is one thing. The carbon footprint obviously is the other. But also, what do you do with a very concentrated brine stream? That is really brine. When we're abstracting at 35,000 parts chloride and you're returning at in excess of 100, it's got to go somewhere. And I know there's been several studies done in Australia where they desalinate quite a lot to reinject back into the ground. They do that for saline barriers and whatnot. They have seen some improvement in the biodiversity where the brine goes. So there are probably some good news stories there in some regions, but we haven't done it. So unless we take a big leap of faith and look at the agency and say, well, will you help us do this? We really will find it very difficult to get to that space within the bathing waters, the areas that we have, the protected areas that we have around us. If we paired up desalination with say, an industrial user without the commercial burden that will carry, and the legal burden that will carry, because we tried this option too. We tried to look at if we produce our permeate for a boiler use next door by a big industrial user, and then we trade the license and take their groundwater licenses, say, that could be a match made in heaven. However, because commercially those entities are working against some really high profit margins and really high risk, us missing a day of supply could actually compromise our own commercial, integrity and all the legal ramifications that go with it. Became really difficult to go down that road. So unless that element is actually fixed and be able to then look at how we use this desalinated water very well, that would be difficult. The other thing as well is regulatory requirements on all the aspect of technology. Regulation 31 from the Drinking Water Inspectorate is really key. You can't put this water straight into supply. Therefore, you're looking at producing a very expensive water to put it back into the ground, put it back into a reservoir, because you haven't got the tech or the approval for the tech to be able to use it. So on the one hand, I'm not dissing it as a technology. It's been perfectly fine for many geographies around the world. It is okay to use, but it's just when you look at the cost, the risk, the environmental challenges, and the regulatory framework will have to operate in order to attract those suppliers who can just come in and deploy it, it becomes really prohibitive in that sense. So I'll kind of start with that and see what the others have to say, and then we'll take it from there.
Yeah, thank you. And that's a good overview of the issues around it. Interesting to just pick up briefly on one point that you made there about we haven't done that before here. I've heard that so many times.
Well, I will
in this whole issue about dealing with our water resources problem. We're going to have to do things we haven't done before in the UK. Correct. And that's a real challenge for our regulatory system and our businesses.
And the ones who've got really sharp ears here would go, well, Varsha, Thames Water has one. They actually really have a brackish water desal. They don't have a sea water desal. I just want to preface that before somebody else says, well, we do have it, but it's a brackish water variety, not really a desal. Sorry, Lindsay.
Yeah, no, I find this one really interesting, and it raises a few points for me, because desalination is very much an option in the plan for the Eastern region, Water Resources Plan. The big lumpy stuff, the strategic resource options. We're going through this, through the major public reservoir process, but coming in right up behind it is wastewater treatment and desalination. And if the volume trajectories over the next 2.5 decades are correct, we will need, or we are saying that desal is part of that solution. So then I run into the next thing is, well, because whenever I ask questions about desal, I don't get the satisfactory answer, and I think it's probably because I don't think anyone knows at this stage, about the technology. And yes, it's very costly, the technology at the moment, but is that likely to change? So a desal plant that's commissioned today, is that going to look different from one that's commissioned in 15 years, commissioned to be built? Sorry, not that's ordered. In 15 years' time, and if we think in 15 years' time it's going to be much better, why? What's our basis for that? What research programs are? What science, or what particular science are we chasing on that one? And I think we also, people like me need to have just a better grounding of how these things fit in. Can you use a desal plant for the last cubic meter of water or the last megaliter of water that you need, or is it actually the way these plants work? Has it got to be one of the first megaliters that you need? And I'm interested, Varsha, that you mentioned the Thames plant, because when the Thames plant was needed, it wasn't there.
No.
This thing, it's
so true.
You can't just turn it on and say, well, we need 3 months or 6 months to go through the maintenance program to get it up and running. So and Andy Turner and I were having a look around Spain, parts of Spain last beg your pardon, last Spain, and seeing a desal plant which has effectively been decommissioned because of the brine issue. So what do we, and you raised a point about we don't necessarily understand everything about the brine issues, and and people have said, well, okay, well, one thing we could do is we put the desal plant or the the exhaust pipe, whatever you call it, from just make sure we can move it. So instead of it being point source, you just keep moving it around, and trail it around the North Sea. Well, even that's not, it sounds simple in principle, but in practice. So I think it's really a better understanding of what we mean by desal. What are the implications? Because it's too easy to say, oh, we'll build a desal plant, and there's just so much more to it than that.
Totally.
Yeah, my limited understanding is that one of the biggest issues of it is the power requirement, and hence the carbon footprint.
I could take the whole 2 hours to talk about this, Ian.
Forcing water through a membrane by reverse osmosis is an incredibly power-hungry operation. And maybe one day we're going to reach the sunlit uplands of so much renewable energy deployment that the cost of electricity drops massively, in which case that may change the whole thing about desal. But at the moment, there are far too many industries that are pinning their hopes on that. So, Alistair, you got in next.
Well, actually, you got in first, Ian, because that was exactly the point I was going to raise. But I do think I'm not a desalination expert by any means, but I totally agree with your point. I mean, we've got two very kind of stark environmental challenges, and the decarbonisation of the UK and globally, and that net zero commitments were, this kind of technology currently does really have conflicting issues. It may solve a challenge in one place but create a problem in another area, and particularly for water companies that are trying to balance all of these requirements that we're trying to achieve. And I think that extends across other technologies and other solutions that require the movement of water, the pumping of water around networks, that greater transition. It requires energy, it requires carbon, and to have a sustainable solution longer term, we can look at the take a forward look on renewable energies, etc. But you cannot deal with any of these problems in isolation, and I think desalination is one that there is going to be some real conflicting challenges.
And unless on that point, unless we actually start to really look at the energy, as we were talking about before, and it's the project union, I finally remembered it. If we can pair that up with hydrogen production when we don't really need the water, similar to what Lindsay was saying there, these processes, if you don't keep them going, when you really need them, they're not going to work out for you. So if we are able to then say, so what can I do when there is almost, let's use the word downtime or minimum flow or low flow, I can still produce the same amount of water and keep the system going steady eddy, but I'm actually producing hydrogen and actually doing that mixing of hydrogen and decarbonising as I go. And because the process is such that you are a conventional treatment then backed up by an integrated membrane treatment technology at the end. And then there is the added risk of remineralization at the back end of it. And this is where the public comes into play. They may not like the taste of that recarbonated water. What do you do then? You get a phone call going, well, I'm not used to this water. I'm in the southeast. I don't like this not chalky water. I like my water, a hot water. That's what I'm used to. My kettles love it. No, they don't. My iron, no, it doesn't. But the problem is, they get used to it. The palate gets used to it. So you then have it an education program. When you're changing a sauce, you've got to be educated. That new sauce may not be what your tea used to taste like previously. So that's another challenge that we need to contend with. But I'll button it for now. Let Andy get it.
Yeah, go ahead, Andy.
Thank you. And I think we've reached, or we're reaching that point where some of those solutions are in the plans or are starting to be developed. And when you look at the different sectors of use, it sort of brings into question the choices that we will have around the future allocation of resources. So if you've got Paul Hickey's world of rapid looking at assessing the future options for public water supply, well, if they're going to take 20 years to develop and to come online, what do we do about allocating and reserving water for them now, so that when they come to being developed, the water is still available to be used and it's not been licensed away. So you've got some challenging questions that we need to answer now for the future. So for water companies, we've got the water resource planning framework that helps support the decision making around that. For the energy sector, it's not as mature. It's not there yet, but the energy sector has probably got more flexibility in where it can put the production to meet the demands. So it's got a bit more geographical flexibility on where it can go. You look at agriculture; it's very local, it's very specific. It doesn't have the funding, as Lindsay has said. It's less able to afford the different options. So there's some really sort of fundamental and challenging questions about the allocation of water and the decisions we make now around that future allocation of water. To what extent is it going to affect things like food security? So the desalination for energy may actually be a really good thing for the wider benefit of water resources and for water availability, for food security, for carbon, for re-wetting peat, etc., etc. So I think it's, we started off this roundtable discussion about stepping back and looking at those wider implications of the decisions and the integrated systems approach. So this, for me, is one example of it happening now.
Thanks, Andy. Trevor?
Thanks, Ian. As some of you may know, down in the southwest, Pennon are progressing a relatively small desal solution. It's for a very acute issue that they've got, because Cornwall goes into a very long, narrow peninsula, as I saw, and high peak demands and those kind of things. So all the problems and issues that Vasa and others have spoken about, and I think covered pretty comprehensively there. But two I'd just like to reinforce, if I may. The first one is with the energy sector and the shift to renewables, actually so much of the investment is going to be rebuilding the network so it can move the energy around from new locations to new demand centres, etc. When we start looking at desalination and some of these other solutions where they're at the lower end of the catchment, it's actually in the wrong place. You want your water resources high up in the catchment ideally, so it all gravitates down without utilising energy and all those kind of things and in the network. So there's some problems with re-engineering the network, but also I think Vasa did mention this, the wholesomeness and acceptability of water is really important when you're adding desal to quite a small localized network. In the Thames situation with the Thames Ring Main, that mixing happens at such a scale that dilution is pretty enormous, and it's relatively, people are more used to sort of subtle changes in taste and quality and odour and those kind of things. But if you, as Vasa said, have someone that's used to sort of hard water or soft water, the mixing of that really desalinated water, which has a very specific taste, is needed, and it will change the end user sort of perception. And that's going to be really quite hard for us to do. And one final point is that when the Solent desalination was still on the cards, Vasa, I don't know whether you're aware, it might have been before you joined.
No, actually, I was on it. I've been on it since 2019.
Oh, okay. We went up to Manchester to look at graphene and whether graphene was a potential solution for the future. So and talked about interoperability between I don't know what you call them, the cells you put in and take out, sort of the filters, etc. But
the elements, the RO elements,
yeah. But I don't think technology is there yet, is it, by a long way?
No, that's the problem with graphene. It was just the cost of it. It was still kind of quite a small volume, small contact areas, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Whereas if you're developing it for 75 million litres a day asset, suddenly you're a little bit hamstrung by the size and all that. Yeah. You
mentioned, Trevor, about infrastructure and being in the wrong place. That's a comment that I've also heard a number of times applied to a lot of our concentration of our wastewater treatment over the last 50 or 60 years, where an awful lot of small local works were closed, particularly thinking back to my old patch in the Lee Valley, where Hertford used to have a treatment works, Ware used to have treatment works, these were all closed and concentrated at Rye Meads. And when you start talking about reusing recycled treated effluent, then somehow you've got to get that back up the catchment to the areas where it's needed. And it's almost universal amongst the people that I meet and talk to on a day-to-day basis that they don't appreciate just how expensive it is to pump large volumes of water. People think because they've sprayed water around the garden with a hose pipe, they know all about water. Once you start pumping commercial volumes, then yeah, the cost soon goes through the roof. Lindsay.
There was at the risk of going off on a slight tangent here, but I'm going to ask you to forgive me this one. What we have here is an issue. It's all about time and space. And I also want to pick up on a point that Paul made in his introduction about getting on with stuff. We have already run out of water in parts of Eastern England. If you want to build a house in Cambridge, or you want to build a new data centre, or even a new hospital in Cambridge, you cannot, because there isn't the water available to service it. If you want to build a food factory in parts of Norfolk and Essex and Suffolk, you cannot, because there isn't the water to service it. And when we ask questions about, well, okay, well, when will the water be available? As things stand now under the normal processes in Cambridge, it will not see a significant, as things stand, it will not see a significant shift in new water coming into Cambridge until 2032 for part of it, and 2039 for another part of it. And that is to solve a problem that exists today. Okay, so those are just examples. They're saying, well, how do we speed this process up? And what I know we weren't talking about that, Ian, but it was just that comment about the time and space thing. Park it for another part of today or another day, that's absolutely fine. But getting on with stuff is, we're good at talking about things, but actually getting on with sorting it out is, our track record isn't that strong, in my opinion, but I may be being unfair.
Well, I'll just jump in here if that's okay, Ian. There's a lot of truth in what you said there, Lindsay, but I think what's missing in this sort of piece there is, whereabouts do you buy land ahead of time for you to be able to start the planning process? And that requires forward thinking, that requires, ahead of time, almost conceptualizing. If we have to have a desalination plant, inevitably it's going to be near the abstraction point. Is land available there for these large infrastructure? Then comes the planning process, then comes the route to get the chemicals in and out, the construction time and the interference it's going to cause, and the problems it's going to cause. So when you think about this forward planning, it's almost, it kind of begs the question, are we planning the land that goes with alongside the permitting process as well? Because that's where we've fallen short in my mind, is we've never made space and time. We always have to go and look to acquire land. That in itself is a process. And it's never quite that easy, because water companies are not obviously real estate companies. They don't buy land and keep them for a long time and all the rest of it. So you wonder whether there is a bit missing here. Are we also, when we write them in our WRMPs, are we buying land at the same time and taking into account expansion of flow that you may get from it? So we're not just buying land to put a 10 MLD facility, we're buying land to put a 100 MLD facility in the future. And that's where I think it's somehow slightly difficult, because then you can't marry up the follow-on processes together, the piping, the chemical, as I say, and the network around it as a whole. It becomes rather problematic. And if you couple that with the lack of innovation around these large treatment facilities, so for example, one could say, well, you know what, I will take this brine and I will extract chlorine gas from it, and I already got a disinfectant right there. You can electrolyze it, here comes your chlorine, mix it with water, away you go, your disinfectant is ready. You could do that, but it also warrants an amount of energy. It warrants the safety aspect around it to produce chlorine gas. So there's a number of facets to this conversation, Lindsay. And I think that's somehow where we oftentimes take, we'll use this word, this statement really crudely, but the path of least resistance. And that somehow is never compatible with a bit of innovation, if you will.
One of the things that's repeatedly been pointed out about the Victorian approach to to society was the forward thinking and the over design and the long planning timescale, long life timescales that were built into a lot of their developments, and hence the fact that we're still using Bazalgette sewers and
Yes.
old canals and things like that. That's something that we seem to have completely lost, isn't it? And it's something that it seems the water industry in particular desperately needs to find some way of regaining that ability to say, look, we think this needs doing. Somehow we have to take a risk on this and go ahead and start doing it. And that's where it gets difficult when the companies are all private, are all public companies responsible to shareholders, and
Exactly.
the commercial risk is the thing that really holds you up.
I was about to say just
yeah.
that. I was about to say just that. If we could take that hurdle out of the whole pathway, we would be set. We would be absolutely set. But it's not like that currently, unfortunately.
Yeah. Paul, I'm conscious from your chat message that you've got to go soon. Is there anything in particular you want to add or sum up with, or before you go?
Yeah, well, firstly, apologies for that.
That's right.
I guess, there are many reasons to be cheerful. Would be one of the things I would say in terms of summing up. I mean, in 2018, there's a signal about moving to cross-sector regional planning, and I think by and large the sector has really embraced that. I think we've got some really positive experiences in terms of the water sector taking a collaborative approach with energy, with farming, other sectors. So I think, we are in a much stronger place in terms of cross-sector thinking. We're also about to embark on a level of investment in water resources that's unprecedented. So the company plans set out between 2 or 3 times the level of investment, both in terms of demand management and new resource development. Delivery will be a really big challenge, as people have commented on, but I do think there's a real commitment to land this level of investment. I do think there's something, Varsha, in what you're saying about the connection between technical planning processes and spatial planning, not just because of the land acquisition, but also, that as we have more complex and contentious interventions, actually you introduce more risk that plans aren't actually viable.
Yeah.
So I think increasingly, and that's one of the things we've been doing, is in parallel to the technical planning process, is test that these projects are, permittable. So, and I guess the only other thing I would add is that, we do have a sector that has a really bad problem in terms of reputation. And I think, that is something that we will only change through doing the things that are needed, both on the wastewater and water resources side, because rebuilding that trust, I think, is going to be absolutely key if we're going to make the step changes we need to see in terms of water efficiency and influencing people's behaviour. So I think the only way that, as I say, we will achieve that is by doing the things we set out in the plans that companies are consulting on. So Ian, those are my couple of reflections, but I do think, if we do the things that we've set out in plans and focus on delivery, that I think there is a way through this. Thank you.
Okay, thanks for that, and thanks very much for your input all the way through. It's been really useful having you. Unless there's anything else anyone particularly feels they need to add on that particular line of thought, I was just going to pick up towards the end of this on a combination of the sort of catchment solutions thing and nature-based solutions, and whether anyone's got any additional thoughts around those, what the potential for them is, but also what the hurdles are for them, and how we how we try to facilitate their expansion. Any particular comments? Yeah, go ahead, Lindsay.
I'm a great supporter of the micro approach. I know it's not the whole answer, but I think in terms of optimizing access to water, then that bottom up, that micro level assessment is not a bad starting point. We've gone through a sustained period of having the freedom and liberty to look at water resources planning at a macro scale. We've been able to do it at a macro scale because the water has been there to support it. We're now moving into a period where we have to look at the more difficult and the more complex solutions. So, I've already mentioned that I'm involved in some work that's looking at this. Water Resources East is involved in a lot of work with particularly in Norfolk with nature-based solutions. And so I guess what I'm leading up to here is the mechanism of delivery. How does it work with lots of relatively minor interventions on the ground, adding up to something of significance on a landscape or wider scale, and that raises the issue of funding. And so the initiative in Norfolk is sort of based on a funding model, a water fund to make all of this work on the ground, because all these interventions do cost money, and who's going to pay? It doesn't, the bill doesn't land on one doormat. And also, how do you when it's quite common for the funding sources to be from quite quite lumpy and relatively speaking very large budgets. How do you get that? How do you get that funding down into farmer level when for each landowner or land manager, it's a relatively small amount of money that's needed to deliver the changes, but it's coming from a very large pot, and how do we match those together? So it's about capability building, but it's also about understanding the real value of these interventions. I don't think we, and I'd be interested to get Alistair's thoughts on this one. Do we understand, for example, how we can change, objectively, how can we change the soil water holding capacity of our soils? How much difference will that really make? Because it just seems to me that we're in the business of subjective analysis. It feels like a good thing, and there's a strong move in agriculture at the moment. There's so-called regenerative movement, which means all sorts of things to all sorts of people. But it's all about treating this basic resource of the soil in a slightly different way. And how can we use the whole landscape as a reservoir in its different aspects, whether it's the soil, the open drains, the things we recognize as reservoirs, wetlands, all those sorts of things in a coordinated and structured way to benefit legitimate users of water. So it's a big part of it.
Alistair, over to you.
Thanks, Ian, and thanks, Lindsay, as well. I think you've touched on some really key points there, and I've been kind of looking at catchment and nature-based solutions for a long time, and they've been primarily for water quality, to deliver a specific benefit in a specific area for a specific objective. I think the more we've been developing and delivering these, you start to realise some of the multiple benefits, the wider benefits. So water resources being one. Biodiversity, and you start to think, you can see there's actually more just to focusing on one particular issue. And I think the gap at the moment, and the area that needs to be focused, is around evidence. At the moment, there isn't evidence into the effectiveness, particularly from a water resources perspective. I've engaged through our water resource planning over a couple of cycles now to try and get catchment nature-based solution schemes more embedded into our planning, but they don't deliver, or there's not the evidence to deliver a complete, clear, deployable output benefit. So they're very much looked at from a resilience perspective, looked at some of those wider challenges. And I think and your point around lots of micro actions become delivering a greater benefit overall. And you can deliver measures that cover 100, 1,000, 10,000 hectares, but we're potentially looking at actions that are 100,000, millions of hectares, that suddenly when you start to quantify those benefits on the macro scale, you can start to see those kind of numbers. And I think without that evidence and without that line of sight through to what you need to do to integrate lots of small measures into one big kind of overall benefit, I think that's where we're lacking. Now, there is a project ongoing at the moment funded through Ofwat around mainstreaming nature-based solutions, which a large number of the water companies and other organisations are involved in, that will start to look at these challenges. But I think we've got a long journey ahead of us. But when you actually start to think it and actually see some of these actions in practice on the ground, you walk onto a field that normally you would walk off with half the field stuck to your boot, but you're walking on it, it feels like a sponge. You walk off with a clean boot. You see that benefit to biodiversity just by the way that land's been managed. You might see the neighbouring farm with water rushing out of the gate with soil and sediment, but on this field it just seems to be absorbing. The visual, you can see these things, you can see the benefits that these things will have, but without that quantification that then can drive that investment, there is a huge gap. And we've looked at measures for some of our water quality schemes, and we've assessed the benefit over a wider natural capital, wider ecosystem services, and actually the economics just for the water quality scheme did not stack up at all. But when you look at it across climate change regulation, water resources, farming productivity, suddenly the numbers really do start to add up. So we're changing our thinking on how we approach these schemes, trying to look beyond just that single issue problem. And I think the more evidence, the more that can be brought into that field, and more influencing around strategic planning that can be done. I think we've got to accelerate the pace of doing that.
Yeah, it's a natural mirror image of the whole discussion in the flood risk industry around nature-based solutions, isn't it? The two really go hand in hand, because clearly holding water onto land better in a way that doesn't interfere with the way the land is farmed offers flood risk benefits as well. It has to change the hydrology of the catchments. I can't see how it doesn't. Andy.
I was tempted to put my hand down because it's always difficult following such an expert and someone who's so passionate about the subject matter as well. So thanks, Alistair, for that. My point is one of agreement with both Lindsay and Alistair. I think that it's a really important part of the response, and there can be some fantastic benefits, multiple benefits delivered by schemes. But for me, I think what we need to be careful of is location. I think we need to do more around not just scale, which was some of the points that were made previously, but also location. And it's really important that the right scheme is put in the right place to deliver the benefits. So if you take tree planting, for example, it's not always a positive benefit for water resources. If you put conifers, broadleaf or oak in the wrong place, it can actually be a detrimental effect. So I think opportunity mapping, both on a positive look, but also a negative look of where we don't want things, needs to be a step forward. And I also agree with the point made about the strategic approach. I think a lot of initiatives I've seen over the years, let's take river restoration, for example. I know it's not an example that we've talked about so far, but I think a lot of that has been piecemeal and opportunistic. It's not particularly being joined up to make sure that habitats that are created are linked. And if we were to do more of that and be more effective at doing that, that would improve the resilience of the environment, as well as improving and protecting water resources. So fully support what's been said.
Arsha.
So to me, and I agree with what Andy's just said around location, that was one of the challenges that we had looking at using nature-based solution. But the other element to that is the ownership of the land that we're trying to, who actually owns this land, because it's not a Southern Water owned asset, for example. We'd be working in partnership with a third party. And if we were looking at cost management and we have to have this stop and start approach to delivering water, suddenly you've now caused a problem, because you can't sustainably produce this water, which is a very costly water, to be putting that into the environment. And now, you're withdrawing it back. It's just it's how do you achieve this balance of cost of producing very expensive water, or do you treat it partially so you're able to use a nature-based solution, but then you're faced with environmental permitting components to it that you want to be able to clean it well enough so it doesn't pollute the receiving waters? Or how do it has to be a match made in heaven on so many fronts that it becomes too problematic, and suddenly the solution becomes, it's unsustainable, unachievable, and it's riddled with challenges, and you kind of lose interest in pursuing it. But I'm still a big believer. Sometimes there are good opportunities and everything just sings along nicely and you grab it and you run with it. But with the solutions that we're looking at, where water recycling has become the primary option, pairing those solutions up with a nature-based solution have become very difficult, particularly when you're producing water from an RO process. Yeah, so that's my two cents on that front. I wish we could do a lot better, but there are still some environmental issues and ownership of land issues and continuing producing this expensive water issue we have to contend with. Yes, Alistair, I'll pass on to you.
Alistair.
I mean, I'd agree with all of the points raised there, and I think there's a couple of key areas around that, and there's the tolerance for risk. So, we are very cautious around kind of delivering these things that we don't fully understand. And there needs to be opportunities to dare to fail, to try these things, to see what happens, manage those risks, manage it around the permitting, the support for the landowners, etc. And I think that lends itself to Andy's point about having the right thing at the right place at the right time. And I think there's another issue there, and I think Varsha, you touched on that, is around a lot of this is going to be done on third-party land. It could be done on a combination of different land. There's got to be an ongoing management and maintenance program. There's got to be that support for that landowner. The water industry can only invest once, then it becomes business as usual. And on third party land, that investment case doesn't stack up. So actually, how do we continue to support? If you're developing a nature-based solution, you want that to deliver the benefit, not just over 1 year or 5 years, you want that over, 50 years and beyond. And that, that needs to be continually managed. Otherwise, you're potentially creating more issues for yourself,
Absolutely.
which I think it lends itself to engineering solutions as well. But I think, these discussions have to happen, and we're hitting challenges, say, with the river restoration program around things like impoundment licenses. Who owns the ongoing liability and responsibility for things like that? Does it sit with the landowner? Does it sit with the water company? Is it a shared ownership? It can put landowners off if they suddenly pick up a whole load of liability that may mean significant cost for them in the future. So it can be an immediate barrier. I mean, it's, there's a whole kind of policy thing, but also, that kind of systems approach that needs to be thought about.
Yep, for sure.
Right. I'm conscious that we're very close to 12 o'clock now. In the same way as with Paul, I shall run round and just see if you've any final thoughts to add. Can I start with Lindsay?
Thank you very much for this conversation. I found it really, really encouraging. It just reinforces my view that we have got a lot to be optimistic about for the future. But from a farming perspective, the way everything sits, and I come back to this time-based issue, that as we move through the next 10 years or so, the kinds of things that the regulator has no choice other than to do in terms of impacting agriculture's access to water for irrigation, there is the potential for a lot of farming businesses to be severely disadvantaged in this. So it's this time thing of getting things in the wrong order. So we might have the water available in 20 years' time, but if it's taken away in 10 years' time, then or 5 years' time, then that isn't going to help those businesses, and it gives me a problem in representing them. And what do we need to do in the meantime? So it's the time element of solutions and time to adapt, and the science, the evidence base that we're imposing change for the right reasons.
I'll come to Virginie next, because you haven't spoken for a few minutes, so go ahead.
Thank you. And I think what Lindsay said just builds on quite nicely with what I was thinking of saying, is that from a scientific point of view, it's been a really interesting meeting. And the bits that I took away was we need more research in terms of nature-based solutions with a strong focus on evidence base. And the other aspects that were highlighted to me is in terms of the desalination plants, their environmental impacts. Those were the two that I take away as a scientist. You know, how can our science best support your needs so that we can cooperate?
Andy?
Thank you. It's been a pleasure to be involved in this debate, and whenever I'm involved in conversations like this, I always come away with a strengthened sense of how complex and uncertain things are, and also the serious challenges that we're faced with in the future. And I think we've got a huge collective responsibility to manage and plan and deliver against that. The take-home points, I think, for me, are that we need to work collaboratively. That's been loud and clear. Water resources planning cannot be done in isolation. We need both integrated decision making, but also multiple benefits and integrated solutions. Loads of good things happening to help improve that at the moment. So there's real positivity, but there's a hell of a long way to go and lots of improvements needed to improve the planning. But the point I'll finish with, I think, is what we've heard from many of the panelists, that it's not about the planning, it's about ensuring that the plans are delivered. So it's about delivery, delivery, delivery.
Thank you. Trevor.
Thank you, Ian, and thank you everyone for being a part of this today. So I think we've heard that there's been, and there is, a lot of progress, as Paul put it, reasons to be happy. I think we've also heard a tremendous amount of consensus on where we need to spend more time and effort, very little dissent and differences between panel members at all. And I think we all agree that senior decision makers have some big decisions and our leaders some big decisions to make over the coming years, but that cannot be for us to defer responsibility to them. I think the responsibility is for us to bring this kind of debate, the decisions that are needed, to them with consensus, because then it's so much easier for them to do their job. And this type of event can only help that, to understand what needs to change, who agrees, and how maybe we put it together, and different agents that will take it forward up to those leadership decisions. So thank you very much.
I'll bring me solutions, not problems. Yeah.
Yeah.
Varsha.
That's normally my line to my sons. Enough of this problem. Just don't dish out the problem. Show me the solution. How are you going to fix this? I took a lot from today's session, actually, and thank you so much to everyone. And thank you, Ethne, for inviting me, Mark Herwig, an old colleague of mine, for inviting me. I thought it was really, really enlightening and useful, particularly from Lindsay's standpoint, because I never get to hear from the farmers community side what goes on in the challenges. And I used to live in Peterborough, so I used to be very versed with the eastern side of the country, having also worked for the water company that serves the area. So I know what challenges you guys go through. So it's been very enlightening, actually. From my side, I think what I took away and where I'm kind of focused on is delivering the plan is absolutely crucial, essential, critical, one might say. But I also am I'm also always on the lookout for how do we join up thinking with other industries that could help us meet the target that we've set out. Without the support of the energy side, without the planning from a wider multilateral investment, it would become really problematic. Energy is the biggest one for me, because all of these solutions we're proposing are energy hungry assets, and if we can't join them together, Lindsay will have a cat in hell chance of progressing his agricultural motivations, and because it's just expensive tech. Everything is now more expensive. So delivering against the plan is right, but if the funding and the joined up thinking is not done, I fear that we're going to get into a point where not everything we anticipate we'll be able to achieve. And that's where my concern is. We try to bring in innovation, lowering cost and all the rest of it, but it needs to be a multilateral way of thinking about how we execute. And that's where I'm coming from. But I've learned a heck of a lot. So thank you. Thank you.
Well, thank you for coming along. Alistair.
I'll echo, yeah, I'll echo absolutely everything that's been said there, and a big thank you for inviting me along today. I think just from my perspective, obviously I'm a strong promoter of working with natural processes to bring solutions. I don't believe we can keep solely building ourselves out of problems. I think there is obviously, as been mentioned, a need for the evidence to justify the investment in nature-based solutions and working with natural processes. I think by bringing that evidence, you can then unlock finance. You can bring in insurers in the same way that's been happening around NFM. You know, you can bring that investment in. It doesn't just have to come from one sector. You can meet those multiple objectives, including water resources, by bringing all of that into one place. And I think we've got to start there, continue that debate, and not delineate built solutions away from natural solutions.
Right, thank you everybody. We're just on 12 o'clock now, so it just remains for me to thank you all for coming along. It really has been quite a fascinating discussion and a very broad-ranging one. I'm heartened by the amount of agreement that there's been between us. We would encourage you to get involved in the Foundation for Water Research if it's of any interest, and some information on that will be emailed out to anyone who isn't already part of it later on today or after today. So thank you all very much for coming, and I look forward to coming into contact with you again at some point in the future. Thank you.